Okay. Good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are. If you're watching live, if you're watching this on demand, welcome, whatever time of day you've chosen to do this. I'm Ben. I'm the editor-in-chief at the Interline, which is a technology publication for the fashion industry. I got the pleasure of hosting and leading today's session, and I'm going to walk you through first a little bit about why we're here, what we're going to talk about. I'm going to introduce you to my fellow speakers, and then we're going to get straight into some demonstrations and conversation. So in my role, I spend less time writing than you might think as the owner of a magazine. And I spend a lot more of it in conversations with fashion brands, with material suppliers, and with a pretty broad spectrum of technology companies. And a bunch of those conversations have, for the last couple of years, focused on digital product creation, which you're going to hear me and probably everybody here refer to as DPC over the course of this conversation. So that's what that stands for. And that's because fashion's been making a major strategic push into working in 3D for a while now. But that push really reached a tipping point during the pandemic. Now, we really have time to get into exactly the full spectrum of why everybody moved towards wanting to work in 3D, because it can be pretty all-encompassing. But the simplest way to distill it is that across the supply chain, there's a vision to make creative and commercial choices based on digital representations of things rather than needing physical versions of them all the time. During the pandemic, there's a pretty obvious argument for that. Those physical versions were hard to get hold of, but pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, the same vision is there and the same strategic drive is there. Now, digital representations of physical things can refer to finished products, production samples, salesperson samples, and so on. But it also refers to the components of those products and samples. And fabrics, materials, and trims are probably the key elements there. So when we reached that industry tipping point, it very quickly became clear that if fashion was going to scale the vision that it had for 3D and digital product creation, the industry would need a supply of accurate, interoperable, scalable digital materials to work with, because materials are such a fundamental piece of every product. You have 3D avatars, 3D simulations of garment patterns, you need 3D materials to work on them with. And putting together that supply became a major task with potentially major mutual benefits for both brands and their upstream partners. Now, we're talking in late 2024, and it's no secret that every industry is staring down a bit of a difficult economy, and fashion is no different. That means that people's attentions kind of turn to some of these innovations and new ideas, and some extra scrutiny gets applied to them to make sure that they're still delivering value, that they're still good ideas. And that includes digital product creation and material digitization. So what we want to do today is to look at how the business case for those two things stands up to that kind of scrutiny. We want to look a little bit what's happening at the technology and the cultural level around those two things. And we want to talk about what role digital fabrics and digital ways of working are likely to play in fashion's near-term future. So I'm going to introduce you to my fellow speakers in a second, but first I want to run through the structure of what we're going to do today. Kate, you mind? Fabulous. So we're going to shortly have an introduction from Kate Absher of Cotton Incorporated. Then we're going to move into a structured panel. So I have host prerogative and I get to ask my pet questions. As we're doing that, as Kate's talking, as we're talking, you should be able to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A box in the webinar platform. What we will do is we will then get back to those at the end of the structured conversation, rather than kind of stopping and starting. There's a lot of different perspectives. Now, we do actually have record numbers of people signed up for this session, so I can't promise we're going to be able to address absolutely every question. But as we're speaking, you put your questions into the Q&A panel as they come to you, and I will pick up the top few for us to tackle at the end. Any really good ones that I think we don't have time for, we will try and take offline as well and address via email. One other quick reminder would be, if you need to drop off for any reason while you're here, this full session will be available via replay on, I believe, Monday, sort of early next week through Cottonworks. At this point, I think I want to introduce my two speakers for today. So we have Kate Absher from Cotton Incorporated and Brandon Ronan from J.Crew, both good friends of mine and both people who have deep and different vantage points on DPC. Can I ask both of you to intro yourselves by telling us a bit about what you do day to day? Kate, I'll go with you first.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that great introduction, Ben. I'm Kate, and I am the manager for fashion and digital design marketing for Cotton Incorporated. One of my main responsibilities here is to create and manage the digital fabric library. I also serve as the 3D and DPC specialist for the company. I do some 3D content creation to like market and promote our fabrics, and then of course I also do I help to create, manage, and deliver our educational content where it relates, primarily to technology and DPC. So that's a little bit of what I do.
Amazing. And Brendan, same question to you. I'm going to ask you both a bit about your kind of 3D journeys as we go on. But at the moment, what does your day to day look like?
Cool. Thanks, Ben. Hey, everyone. I'm Brendan. At J.Crew. I started in September, so I'm fairly new, but I'm the director of product operations. And in my role, I'm overseeing all ways of working for our J.Crew factory division specifically. So that includes the calendar, how we work with our vendors collaboratively, and then most importantly, how we roll out new technology, how we leverage those technologies, DPC and 3D included, to all the different cross-functional partners, and really bringing us into the future and ways of working. So very happy to be here. Thanks, Ben.
Super. Well, very happy to have you both here. Kate, I think we now have an opportunity for you to tell us a little bit more about how the DPC side of things is working over at Cotton Incorporated and Cottonworks.
Absolutely. So for anyone who doesn't know us at Cotton Incorporated, we are a not-for-profit organization that's based in science and research, and we work to help companies be successful with their cotton-related business. We do that by providing a wide range of information, education, services, technical assistance, and innovation for all kinds of fiber products, like apparel and home textiles, but also things like disposable wipes, health products, and other kinds of beauty products. We offer some of the most comprehensive industry information, training, and assistance through our website, cottonworks.com, which is a free online resource for every aspect of cotton. We encourage anyone online today to sign up for a free account so you can take full advantage of all the resources available to you. You do have to go online and opt in. You won't get an account just by joining the webinar today. One of those resources that we offer is the Digital Fabric Library, where we offer free, high-quality digital twins of our inspirational cotton fabric developments that are designed and often made here in our North Carolina headquarters. Today, right now, we have over 450 unique fabrics compatible with both Clo3D and Browser V-Stitch are available for download. Once you have an account, you can access all those files by visiting cottonworks.com, navigating to resources, and then choosing the Fabricast collection option. Our other main DPC resource is our educational webinars. We have an introduction to digital materials video. We have a DPC best practices and implementation webinar, and our most recent video on making the case for DPC, where we presented some case studies and discussed ways of speaking to leadership about the benefits of DPC, which is kind of a good prelude to today's conversation. So if you're interested, you can find those at Cottonworks under topics and then selecting digital product creation. So that's the end of my spiel. Thank you all for bearing with me, and let's get to the conversation.
Yeah, perfect. So as I mentioned at the top of this, folks, I'm going to talk to Kate and to Brandon, and we're going to go through some of the topics that I mentioned. Questions that you have as they come to you, type them into the Q&A box, and we will shortlist the ones that we have time to answer later on, and we will take some others offline as we can. Now, I'm by no means a 3D expert. I've been around it enough to know a bit, but I've always been a computer graphics person. And I think ever since I got into fashion 15 years ago, that's why 3D and DPC have been my favorite topics. could you each tell me a bit about your own history with 3D and digital product creation, where it began? Like what, Kate, I'll start with you. What sparked the interest for you in 3D? And is it the same thing that interests you today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started out as a fashion designer in art school at the Savannah College of Art and Design, and I always really liked the process of taking like a flat piece of paper, a pattern, or a piece of fabric, and then turning it into something three-dimensional. And that's definitely something that I still really enjoy about the current sort of slate of 3D softwares out there that we work with, that we support. I interned briefly during that time in fashion. I was working in technical design, and I remember doing so much manual work with all the samples and TOPs, and doing all kinds of like very manual recording of all kinds of like information, and then having to cart these massive carts of samples down to storage, and then just like shove them into these racks that are just crammed full of samples, and thinking to myself like we should really come up with a better solution for this. And then fast forward a couple of years, I went back and studied inclusive design strategies at NC State, and I did that kind of area of study through the lens of 3D garment simulation and how that can be used to design various products. So, and then I was brought onto the team here to start creating digital materials for cotton. So that's my background.
Amazing. And I think yours is that desire to kind of shorten the distance between an idea and having something tangible that you can showcase and you can interact with is probably where a lot of kind of 3D interest starts, and where it's a lot of kind of 3D design careers in particular start. Brendan, same question to you. How did you get into this? And are you passionate about the same stuff today that you were when you started?
Absolutely. I actually, funny enough, have a very similar background as Kate. I actually started in domestic production in the garment district, and it was kind of my 101 course into the fashion industry. And during my time there, I had an amazing manager who was a master pattern maker, and it was the one thing that I couldn't just like learn on my own. And I ended up taking a pattern making certification course at FIT, and I thought it was just so interesting to learn how the garment was structured and put together, and the fabrics that were involved and how it drapes. And it really just like helped me understand from the very beginning, like how this garment was made to its truest form. So that's kind of where my interest started. But I always had a, huge interest in technology, and I, wanted to get involved somehow. And so my next job after that was actually implementing PLM. And on that team, we were, having PLM as the backbone of the team and implementing it throughout many different divisions. But we also had a separate team that was looking into the future-facing technologies that were coming our way. And one of those was 3D, and I kind of got a preview of it working in Browseware and Clo. And when I saw it, I thought it was just fascinating. I thought it was like one of the coolest things ever. And then kind of connecting the pattern in that tool and realizing that something that I just learned was actually going to be useful in a digital way, kind of just really, connected the dots for me. And, this was in 2016. So ever since that point, I just was so interested in like how that came together and how I could, leverage my pattern making skills and see how far I could really take it. And then tried to get in 3D any way I could in my future jobs after that.
Yeah, it's funny. You and I both. I got my start in PLM as well, from a kind of an analysis perspective. And weirdly, I think the first deep dive report I ever did on 3D and digital product creation was in about 2017. So not a million miles away from the dates on your side.
Very cool.
Before we get too far into the weeds today, I think it's maybe useful if we do some defining. Like I can give people my take on what I think 3D means, what DPC stands for, maybe what digital fashion is all about. But I'd like to get your folks first, not least because people can go read our DPC report. They don't need to hear my definitions here. Brendan, I'll go with you. Are
Sure.
those all useful terms, or do you think they create some confusion? Are people clear about what we're talking about when we talk about DPC?
Yeah, I think it's a slow progression. I think people are getting there. When I first got into this world, 3D was the only term. And then over time, I think people realized that it was much more than just designing in 3D, creating a 3D sample. And that's when it started taking shape into digital product creation, because at the end of the day, because you are transforming and digitizing your products, it ultimately becomes a business transformation. And I think digital product creation really encapsulates that in a nice way, because you are digitizing from the beginning to the end, the entire life cycle of that product, including fabrics and trims and everything that makes up that style. So I think it was confusing. I think it's becoming more clear, and there is a need to have all of them, because you do work in 3D, but digital product creation is when you kind of enter that next level of transforming your business end to end.
That's a really good definition. Kate, how about you? How do you think about these things?
Totally agree with there's a lot of terms, and sometimes, people aren't quite sure what means what. I completely agree on the distinction between 3D and DPC, DPC being more encompassing. When I hear digital fashion, on the other hand, I'm thinking more of like things that can veer into some of the digital only use cases, where the goal is to use digital assets in virtual environments, video games, in XR applications, in the metaverse, whatever that term might mean here in 2024, Roblox or Fortnite or Horizon Worlds, if anyone is into that. Point being that the digital fashion kind of refers more to the digital asset being the end product in itself, where DPC is about using these technologies to create a physical end product.
Yeah, I think we're all pretty much aligned here. Like I would define 3D is over here as a set of tools and skills that you use to design, sample, simulate, visualize in 3 dimensions. Digital fashion is exactly what you've just described. I would pigeonhole that very much as something that is designed to have a digital only endpoint. There's some crossover between the tools and the skills and the pipelines and things across all of that. Then DPC is the big circle that sits around all of it, because that's when you start to bring in all of the different pieces that you need to do that business transformation that Brendan is talking about. And that means not just a transformation in design and development, but a transformation that goes across sourcing and material development and production and sales and marketing. So yeah, I think we're all aligned there. You have it for the audience. If you have been thinking kind of primarily 3D, that's not wrong. But what the industry as a whole now is migrating towards is the idea that 3D design, digital fabrics, everything else around it can ladder up into a bigger change in the way that fashion operates.
Ben, could I ask
Yes.
a question to you and Brendan? What
Yeah.
are the terms that you're hearing that are most common for digital materials? Is it digital
Mm.
materials? Is it digital fabrics? Is it 3D ready? I mean, I've heard a number of different things, and I'm not sure that there's a major consensus in the industry right now. I would love to get your takes.
Brendan, I'll let you go first.
Sure. Yeah, so I've heard a lot of those. I think really the ones that stick out are digital fabrics and digital materials. Where it starts to get a little gray is when you're talking about digital trims, right? So I think when people talk about digital materials, they sometimes forget that it encapsulates both of those things. And even if it's just like a digital, jelly tape, for an example, I'm just throwing something random out there. But I think it's kind of the same idea as like 3D versus DPC. Digital materials, I think, encapsulates more, whereas digital fabrics really is just the fabric piece.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think 3D ready is a weird space because what constitutes 3D readiness kind of depends on what you want to do in 3D. And you will find this is something I think we probably touch on as we go. The characteristics and the parameters and the attributes you need for a digital material will vary depending on what your use case is. So what's 3D ready for one company from the point of view that they want to use it for visualization primarily might not be the same as 3D ready for a company that does performance sportswear and they want to use it for simulation and fit testing and all of that kind of stuff. So I think until we get to like a real codified standard for what constitutes like a full-on 100% comprehensive digital material, 3D ready is a weird one. So yeah, digital materials and digital fabrics, I think, are the two that I hear the most.
Thanks for
Cool.
indulging that little expression. Awesome.
That's fine. I was not expecting anyone to flip the script on me today, so I'm gonna take it though. It's fun. Let's talk about some industry context. And Kate, I'm going to ask you this one first. Now, I mentioned it in my intro. Obviously, it's not a terrific climate right now, depending on what sort of sector you're in. There's a lot of variability across different brand and retail segments, and there's some pretty divergent outlooks for different tech companies as well. There's this feeling that in difficult times, like I mentioned earlier, tech initiatives are maybe the first thing or a logical thing to not stop, but to temporarily put to one side with the assumption that you can pick them up again later. So at a time when profitability and margin is top of mind, maybe something that's still seen as a little bit experimental gets put a pin in it over here and come back to it afterwards. Independent of any particular brand or specific project, is that something you've seen? And I guess what's your take on the idea that you can put a pin in tech-enabled or tech-adjacent projects and then come back around to them afterwards?
Yeah, that's certainly a perspective that we've heard too, and something that we've, kind of seen in the industry where, there's always been, there's almost been a little bit of maybe a backslide after some of the progress that was made between like maybe 2018, 2021. Some companies who were working on, these technology projects have maybe stalled a bit in the past couple of years, or even like reverted a little bit back to old ways amid, a climate of layoffs and maybe other economic setbacks. To that, I would say that having like a more efficient, a faster, a less wasteful way of working are a benefit in good times and bad. We all know that conditions in the past couple of years have been, somewhat rocky, and it looks like that climate could continue into the future. I would say, if the idea is to sort of, pause and then pick it up later, I would say I think the danger there is that, you could end up even a little bit further behind. If you think that, because all of this has been progressing, it feels to me faster and faster in the past couple of years. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. And then, I think if you wait for the best time, the most ideal time to innovate, then like your company probably isn't going to do much innovation.
I think that's a good answer. I think one of the things when we talked about kind of 3D readiness and standardization and things as well, if a brand chooses not to do this at the moment and they choose to look back around to it in the future, they kind of forego the opportunity to be a part of developing what that workflow looks like and what that standard looks like. And when you loop back around to it, maybe you find it doesn't necessarily fit the way that you work. So there's a chance to actively contribute to the growth of something that is going to influence the way the industry works in the future. And that's a weird thing to miss out on, I think. Brendan, how about from your point of view? What are you seeing here?
Yeah, I totally agree with both of you. I think a lot of companies, not just with digital transformation and technologies, but also just general transformation initiatives. I think a lot of companies, when the going gets tough, they decide to shelve it. And it's kind of, the take one step forward, two steps back mentality. And to your point, Ben, if you are missing out on those times when everyone else is excelling, you're going to take a backseat and you're not going to be able to contribute to what everyone else is doing. And I think honestly, consumers pick up on that. They can see when, companies are pushing forward, and, those are the companies that they gravitate towards. They want to see companies that are innovating and trying new things. And it's always a panic when you decide to try something when the going gets tough. And it's always best, from my experience, that you kind of double down on these initiatives when it's really good. And when it gets tough, you continue through it, you push through it, because it just needs to get over that hump that, things will get better. And once it does, you're going to be ahead of the game. And if you take that two steps back, then you're going to be even further behind than you ever realized. So I think it's even more critical to just make incremental growth because the technology is compounding every year. And if you miss out on even 6 months, then you're missing out on even more than you think. So it's extremely important.
No, that's a great perspective, and I think as well there's a bit of a sliding scale between like technology maturity and industry maturity sometimes. Like there are areas where I would say the 3D and DPC technology ecosystem is maybe ahead of where the average business is at. There are areas where the reverse is true, where the demand from brands, from retailers, and suppliers is perhaps outstripping what the technology is capable of, which means that the two kind of parties need to work together and need to be active participants in that conversation so that we get to the right level once, investing now with a view to that business transformation picking up when times are not so hard. I had another question for you, Brendan, which was, so you're somebody who's seen 3D transformation from a few different perspectives. I want to get your take on where you think it really sits in the overall like digital transformation agenda. Because when you talk to people about 3D, it gets people very keen to compartmentalize it sometimes. There'll be people who say, well, it's a design and development aid, or it's a sourcing and collaboration tool, it's a marketing initiative. What would you say 3D and DPC can do for the industry as a whole, and at the brand and retail end in particular? What would you tell me?
Yeah. I think at this point, it's table stakes to have your business really double down on 3D and digital product creation. I think the fashion and apparel industry in general is always lagging behind from a technology perspective. And one of the things that I notice in all these other industries that are really pushing forward in technology is that they're getting all this amazing data and they're leveraging it. And we're an industry that we could have a lot of data, but we don't because we're not digitized as much as we should be. And therefore, we can't really do anything about it. We're not going to be able to understand our customers better. We're not going to know how efficient we are. We're not going to know if we're doing things the right way as a brand. So I think that it's really imperative that we start getting into this world of leveraging digital tools so that we can build data over time and then do something with that data to make better informed decisions. Because at the end of the day, we have sometimes a 52-week calendar to get a garment produced and into the stores or on our website. And that's a really long time. And that's a lot of information between the start point and the end point that we're not really leveraging. There's market trends and pop culture events and things that are happening in the world that sometimes we're not able to navigate towards or really like pivot towards just because of how analog and manual a lot of our work is. So at this point, it's just necessary to start building that bank of data so that you can make better informed decisions and leverage data in a way that physical garments can't do that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think it brings together the idea that there's value for 3D in design and development, there's value for 3D downstream in marketing, there's value in sourcing and material development and in collaboration. The more of that you do and the more of the data you capture and the more kind of usable your assets and things are, the better each of those areas is able to change the one that comes after it or the one that comes before it. So I think, yeah. And to anybody, anyone in the audience who has maybe been part of a 3D project that's been ring fenced as just like a design and development initiative, again, not wrong, can add a huge amount of value, proven to add a huge amount of value, but the broader transformation is what other places can do with that afterwards and what other disciplines can do with that afterwards as well. Kate, similar question to you, but from your unique vantage point. For the upstream community, companies cutting and sewing clothing and the mills and partners developing materials, where does 3D sit in their view of the value chain?
I would say the views upstream fall into three camps. For some, 3D and DPC can be perceived as something extra that they're being asked to take on, but without necessarily a financial or a competitive advantage that they can see and understand to like go along with that extra effort. I think that perspective can be a little bit more common among companies that really only are dealing with the fabrics themselves. For other companies, I think sometimes they just need to get a handle on like one part of that total end-to-end transformation, and they need to have some success there before they can really see the full picture of what's possible. Organizations like that, they may adopt 3D, but only if their customers are pushing them towards it. Then on the other end of the spectrum, especially ones that for companies that invest more in technology, in R&D, it's seen as much more of an opportunity to streamline development, to improve communication with their customers. We've spoken with mills that have really invested in DPC and heard how much time they've been able to shave off the calendar, how much smoother communication is. They've been able to reduce from 3 samples to 1 or from 5 samples to 2, depending on the customer and the product. So there are those who really see the benefits and are starting to reap those benefits. Then I think there's a third group kind of in the middle that can see the benefits for the industry maybe, but they're not necessarily like pushing forward or pulling back. They're kind of happy to continue business as usual. So I think adoption there is really going to be driven by customer demand rather than the manufacturers trying to push brands in this direction.
Yeah, amazing. And I think, again, the sliding scale thing, there are areas where suppliers are further ahead than their customers in this, and then there are areas where the customers are potentially the ones trying to encourage and incentivize adoption among suppliers. And I think we can talk a little bit about that later on as well. But one of my kind of key takeaways from a lot of the conversations that I've had around this, particularly kind of material digitization, is that there's more of a reservoir of expertise upstream than people necessarily realize. Like suppliers and material developers, mills, they're more advanced in some cases than people know. So it's not a case of just the brand community waiting for the world to catch up. It's very much like a push and pull in different areas.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's much more possible to lean on your, suppliers and for all kinds of assistance with this. So there's probably more capability out there than some brands necessarily realize.
Okay, cool. All right. I think I'm going to get a good perspective on where 3D sits in general. I think we've probably made a good case between us all for why it matters. I want to get a bit deeper into materials and into the business case for digitizing them and why that business case is stronger maybe than ever. So you folks certainly know, I imagine most people in the audience do, materials have a huge influence on product outcomes, from fit and quality to performance, cost. So much of what determines whether a product is a success is governed by what it's made from. But the analog supply chain for developing, procuring, draping, fitting, it's kind of fallen out of lockstep, I think, with a lot of the rest of the way the product life cycle operates, having to obtain physical swatches, having to do multiple rounds of samples, having to test it. It's not necessarily that well aligned with the demands of the market and the speed of the product development calendar and everything else. So Kate, I'll start with you. Could you tell me why you think it's important not just to digitize fabrics, not just to scan fabrics, but to digitize the workflow built around material development and sourcing?
Absolutely. Yeah, so creating and using digital materials and then having a digital workflow infrastructure to store, track, organize, share, collaborate in real time on those materials. They might seem like the same thing, but they're actually almost 2 separate problems to solve. And I know this is a real struggle for some companies. And candidly, it's something that we've had to face in our 3D journey as well. When we first started creating materials in 2020, it was almost a completely manual process, both from the file creation element, but also the storage and tracking. And we were trying to store everything on a single machine. We're trying to track all the data manually in Excel. And what we found was that very quickly it becomes virtually impossible to scale that kind of effort. So I would say, having that infrastructure is just as important as the materials themselves, just for that ability to share, validate, and approve materials with all the cross-functional partners in a single location. It really just brings that efficiency that DPC can provide. Having that ability then, on top of that, for multiple parties to be involved in that creation process. So if you're working with multiple suppliers, having, parties from wherever they're working in the world be able to, take data, take scans, upload them into the same system is also really critical. And then, last and maybe most difficult of all is that real-time representation of product data, which is really critical, but also probably one of the hardest things to achieve.
Amazing. Brendan, same question to you. How do you think about digitizing not just materials/fabrics, but actually transforming the whole kind of material development, sourcing, testing, that whole workflow?
Yeah, it's probably the most important in terms of digital product creation and transforming your business in a digital way. And I think it's kind of taken a back seat, and people are now realizing how important it is. So they're kind of like retrofitting the process to, fix whatever problems they've had. Sitting in sketch review meetings or assortment adoption meetings, the number one thing that people talk about is the fabric. They talk about how it drapes. They talk about, does it hit our cost? And they really, use that as the foundation for a lot of their decision making. So as brands and companies start moving forward into DPC, if you're a mill or a factory, you need to be able to supply that digital material, that digital fabric to the brands so that they can continue to leverage 3D and feel confident in their decision making. It's really going to be the thing that I feel like will kind of like tip people over the edge into accepting digital product creation in 3D, because it's the easiest thing to dismiss. If they see a fabric on there and they're like, this doesn't even represent even close to what I was looking for, you're immediately going to throw it out. And trust is the most important thing when it comes to digital product creation in 3D. And it's a lot of the reason why people start to back out is because they don't trust their fabrics. I think another, really important piece is, not just the mills and factories having their, quality standards and their ability to digitize set up on their end, but for any brand, if you have a fabric team, a raw materials team, it's super important that they start to become educated on how to digitize themselves, because a lot of designers will use a novelty fabric that they found on a travel, and they really want to leverage that. And if there's not if there's not the ability to leverage that in a digital way immediately, they're going to go forward with a physical sample. So being able to digitize in-house and setting up that infrastructure will help that earlier process happen, because I think as you begin starting to digitize materials and fabrics, you start with platform fabrics, core fabrics, things that are like tried and true, but those aren't the ones that, the designers are really thinking is going to make the season. It will kind of supplement the collection, but I think what people get really excited about is that novelty, and those things that are kind of few and far between, that they want to see how that's going to drape. And they don't want to have to get, a sample to see how it drapes. They want to see it immediately. So being able to make that more informed decision earlier with the digital fabric, if it's novelty, is really going to help you kind of move even faster in that process and make a quicker decision.
Yeah, and core fabrics that carried over across multiple seasons are also not really the prime contributors to delays and uncertainty in multiple sample rounds. It's novel fabrics, it's new ideas, it's new concepts. And that's where I see there's a huge amount of value in shifting towards more of a DPC workflow, is that it actually enables you to speed up and cut waste from the areas that slowness and waste is coming from in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel like also, sorry to cut you off, and just one more.
No, you're good.
I think, one of the most difficult things for a designer or a technical designer to do is to sketch into a fabric, not knowing how that's going to drape. And to your point, it will take longer to get that physical sample. And if it comes, 3-4 weeks later, they've already made a decision on, what comes next. And they might even forget about it and drop it. And that's just wasted effort. I think the goal is to make as many informed decisions digitally before you go to physical. And that can just really help in that situation.
Yeah, that's 100% how we've looked at it always. We've always said the holy grail for DPC is being able to make any creative or commercial choice based on a digital representation. The fewer physicals, the better. Kate, I'll come to you with this one. So to do justice to some of that we just talked about, I think there's two attributes of material digitization that are kind of non-negotiable, and that's standardization and accuracy. So if you're going to have a digital material that has the same influence on product outcomes as the physical one, it has to completely represent the end result. That's how you get to that trust that Brandon was talking about. And you also need to be able to lift and shift and use it between different tools so that you have common attributes and metadata and things that travel with it. How far do you think the industry as a whole has to go to get there, to where digital materials can drive real decisions and really influence production?
So I think to an extent, digital materials have already, even as they are, have shown that they can drive decision making in some areas of that production process. Primarily around the design, development, sample approval. I think we've already seen, those cases where they can help design teams make better decisions earlier in the process. But with that said, that ideal of having that complete end-to-end live representation of the fabric is still a ways away. On the accuracy front, I think some of the current industry struggles are coming from the trade-offs that companies have to make between quality, cost, and speed. I think that those trade-offs are going to improve with the advancement of technology. I am hopeful that some of the newer materials platforms and newer materials like digitization methods will be able to significantly reduce that manual work, the time requirements without a major sacrifice in quality. Accuracy and trust, they do go hand in hand, absolutely. And there are real ways, real opportunities for improvement to happen from the technology point of view. But I would also say that trust is developed by doing. At the end of the day, a digital material or a digital sample, it's a tool to help your team make decisions, and using those tools can be learned. If you've heard the term, I heard this term earlier this year, digital craftsmanship. I think it really kind of gets to like the heart of that issue. It's about establishing your standards internally and your processes. And it does take time to train on how to engage with 3D assets on that deeper level so that you can get to that same level of like quality and understanding and creativity that you feel that you can achieve with like current, 2D sketching manual kind of methods. On the standardization front, that really seems to be more about getting all the parties' interests aligned than anything else. Like, we have standards, we have testing methods, we have tolerances for physical fabrics. We can absolutely figure that out and set them for digital materials. I think the idea of a tolerance is kind of a key one that a lot of people who are kind of tripping over the accuracy again and again need to remember. Like, physical materials have tolerances. And so we need to set those tolerances for the digital materials. And then we can just learn how this works and start to trust the process a little bit more as well. I think it'll just take continued industry involvement to help establish those standards and then influence the technology providers to support them. Another great reason, why it's important not to put tech on the shelf, even when times are tough.
No, great answer. Brendan, anything you want to add on that whole kind of standardization piece?
Yeah, kind of to Kate's point, it breaks down in the process when people aren't on the same page and looking and agreeing on the same things. You could say the same thing about a physical sample. Like, if you don't have the right requirements and you don't have the tech design team and the product development team, the design team all agreeing on the same things, there will be a breakdown in communication, and it will delay the process and make things harder to get through. So it's the same thing with digital fabrics and digital materials and quality standards. If you don't all agree on what your expectations are at each point of the process, it will take longer and it will break down the process. And then, to Kate's point, it will make you want to shelve the technology. So it's critical that at every point in the process, what your expectations are and what you hope to get out of that decision making.
No, perfect. Kate, we kind of did most of this before, and I'm aware of time. So a lot of what we talked about is contingent on the involvement of material suppliers and mills. I think we've talked about the incentives for them already. You've already mentioned that, being able to provide digital fabrics to your customers does put you in a competitive advantage, and the same for internal efficiency. Slightly flipping the question, what do you think mills and material suppliers are waiting for their brand partners to be able to really leverage that competitive advantage?
Yeah, I think the businesses that are like kind of solely fabric manufacturers, I think at times they can be some of the hardest to influence, with the current slate of technology, because their customers are so focused on touching the physical fabric. If the fabric's your whole business, then they can't necessarily invest in as much in digital as a company that, like, for example, also makes clothing, right? And they can get that advantage of like reducing the sampling and that kind of thing. So it can be a hard perspective for them to adopt, and even that can even be kind of reinforced from like a brand or a customer perspective. We have heard of fabric manufacturers who started digitizing and then abandoned it because their customers didn't care enough about having the digital twin. I think what they're looking for, what they would need, is a big enough commitment from brands to make it worth their investment. That commitment means, probably like enough customers placing a large enough order, and then requesting that digital material. But I think it also means, at the very least, guidance on creating and validating the digital materials. From many suppliers' perspective, it's going to be the brands who ultimately approve the digital and the physical fabric. So they can kind of tend to think that it makes more sense for the brand to just create the digital material, so they can have it the way they want it. But at the very least, I would say the material suppliers need the brands and the technology providers to provide a scalable and standardized process that they can at least follow for this.
Perfect. No, I think that's a really great set of points. Brendan, we've talked a lot about kind of more of the upstream stuff here,
Yeah.
but I think you hinted at it before with the broader business transformation, but I know a lot of DPC strategies are kind of hinging on the idea that extra value is going to come from where else can you use these digital representations of materials, digital representations of products. Where do you think that extra value is the most likely to come from? When you mentioned DPC as a broader business transformation, if I sit back and I say, okay, I have accurate 3D representations of my fabrics and then products that incorporate them, what more can I do with those? Like, where's the biggest source of value from that?
Yeah. And this is where, to your point, it starts going from 3D to digital product creation. So, there are a lot of teams that leverage those same physical samples that use them in store sets. They use them for photography. They use them for their e-com websites. They use them for just general marketing materials. So when you have that digital asset, you can leverage it for things like crowdsource testing. You can put it in front of your customer and get an understanding. How will this sell? Will it sell for full price? Will I need to discount it? Is it something that the customer will not like? Ideally, you can do that at many stages throughout the process, but that's one way. I think one of the biggest use cases is leveraging it for virtual store sets. So the marketing and visual merchandising teams, they have many different types of stores. They have cold weather stores, they have warm weather stores, they have stores in many different regions throughout the world, depending on how big you are. So being able to understand how you can place those products in a store, if you're leveraging your square footage to the maximum amount, if you're able to get your marketing materials with your digital samples in a virtual way and make sure that it's all aligned before you actually go and ship those physical goods to the stores, is going to be huge. It's going to be huge for these store associates that need to understand, how am I supposed to set up the store? I'm getting thousands of styles and shipments. Like, how am I supposed to really break this out? So that's one way. I also think, just as AI grows, you're going to want to leverage those digital assets that you now have, that is like a smart file and data rich, to be able to activate any of those AI tools that are either available today or going to become available. You're not going to be able to reap a lot of benefits of AI without first having the digital sample. And that could be used for, leveraging on model photography and, meshing it with your 3D asset, which is really incredible. And, there's going to be, different ethnicities and like cultures that are going to be needed to be tailored to a specific way, depending on your region, that you can leverage with the digital asset and AI, for instance. And then just e-com. I think, there are a lot of missed sales from late deliveries from factories, or issues with the DC. You're not able to get that physical sample and photograph and then put on your website. And you can leverage a 3D asset on your website so that you can start getting those sales immediately. and you can even start to pivot. And I think one thing that could be really cool is if you have a digital asset on your e-com website and AI becomes even better than it is today, which it will. You could even have that file change live depending on who's looking at it. Like if this consumer really loves the color blue, maybe they can show it to you in a blue color as a consumer, or you can show it as a different color with a different print and pattern. Just having that flexibility to leverage it in all the different ways that other teams outside of product development teams, like marketing and visual merchandising, but then also your consumer, which is ultimately the most important. How can you get that digital asset in front of them as much as possible? Throughout many different methods.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two bits to that. One is like the more digitization you do, the readier you are for what comes next. Like
Right.
irrespective of whether you believe you know what comes next, like you still being prepared for it and gets you in the right place. The other is there's a whole mess of crap to unpick in terms of how 3D and AI are going to interact, and that's one for a future conversation. I think I will say selfishly, it's something that we will touch on in this year's digital product creation report from the Interline due out in December. So keep an eye out for that one. That does bring me. So I would like it if you folks buy me like 30 seconds to try and synthesize all these audience questions into something that I could actually put to you. So while I'm doing that, what do each of you, and I'll start with you, Kate, what do each of you think is next? What's the next stage in digital materials and in 3D DPC in general? Just give me a short answer.
Short answer, I think it's really going to be about expanding the scalability. We knew we weren't going to get out of this conversation without touching on AI. And I do think that that's going to be kind of the lens through which that scalability really expands. But, the thing to keep in mind there is that, with everything to do with AI, it's as good as the data. As the system is built on, and there is a major need to collect that data. And there's also, I think, a need for closer collaboration between the textile development experts and then the software programmers who are building those AI systems. So keep getting involved. If you're out there in the audience. Short answer.
It's a good. Similarly short answer for you, Brendan. And then I think I've managed to roll a few questions into one.
Great. Yeah, I think number one is going to be standardization and quality standardization, and really, to Kate's point, scaling this to an even greater, proof point rather than just like a small proof of concept or pilot, and really doubling down on vendor and mill collaboration, co-creation. I think as we get more into a digital space, making sure that we can leverage those tools to work even closer together with vendor and mill partners that are, ultimately equal partners in making this product possible, and making sure that they are also on the digital journey as well and committed.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Right. As expected, we had a lot of audience questions. So I'm scrolling through a big list and trying to wrap a few into each one. Folks, if we don't get to your question, I apologize, and we will try and pick it up via email if you have provided a way of contact, or you can reach out to myself, Kate, or Brendan over LinkedIn, I imagine, to put any questions to us as well. There were a few about AI and kind of procedural generation and that side of things and how that corresponds to trust in the digital fabric, that it's producible. Selfishly, Kate and I did a previous webinar during COVID, I think, with the Adobe Substance team about the difference between procedural materials and that side of things. Kate, has anything changed on that regard? There's a couple of folks who sort of asked about the procedural generation side and maybe the use of AI for material creation and how you might be able to hook that into having confidence that the materials are actually producible.
Yeah, so I think that procedural generation as it exists right now is not extremely scalable, for the fashion industry. A lot of what we're working with is more of a scan-based workflow, and that's kind of the workflow where some of the newer digitization, fabric digitization platforms and services are really focusing on. You start with a relatively inexpensive and quick flatbed scan, and then your supporting maps are being generated via AI, which is very, very similar to what was already kind of available in programs like Adobe Substance, where, if you were starting from that, I can't remember what they call it, but that scan-based workflow, the system would just generate that for you. But I think that, the newer platforms, it's about making it, more fashion industry focused. Yeah, I think that there could be opportunities to kind of use AI to help make procedural workflows be able to be done with a kind of a lower bar to entry in terms of a skill set and time. I'm not sure if that really gets like right what they
No,
wanted to.
I think so, and I think as well. You mentioned the use of AI and machine learning to enhance some of the scanning process and to really streamline some of the scanning process. And I think that when you think about kind of tiling and repeats and things like that, or potentially kind of cleanup of scenes and things, there's ways that you can use AI in that regard. There's a couple of questions, and Brendan, maybe this is one for you, which is, and again, folks, I'm rolling a few of your questions into one for time purposes. This is a platform one. So, have you encountered any difficulties in terms of material development teams, sourcing teams, working with vendors in terms of where that collaboration is actually happening? So, where the material library lives, where the conversations around it are taking place. Is that happening in PLM? Are you going to face challenges in terms of which solutions vendors want to use and that whole place? So I guess the crux of it is there is a big collaborative element to digital materials being workable and becoming scalable and becoming part of big libraries. Where does that collaboration happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. At my previous role in Gap, that was a topic of conversation on a weekly basis. Like, where do you store everything, and where do you collaborate? I think right now, PLM and ADAM, digital asset management, they are always going to be the bedrock of any development process. And the ideal scenario is that it lives within either of those. There are also, collaborative tools like Miro or Mural. There are, things like Closette and Style Zone, where you have different versions of interaction and integration where you can look at it at a 3D way, whereas maybe in PLM or something else that's more flat, you only see it in a 2D way. So I think it's really, right now, it's kind of a mixed bag and really dependent on what the teams prefer. But I do think that there is a constant conversation that's happening as to what makes the most sense. But I think all paths are leading towards PLM or a digital asset management tool, because ultimately that's where the style will live. So any way that you connect the style and any of its materials like fabrics and trims included into one place, the easier and more efficient you will be as a business.
Okay, perfect. There's a couple of questions about specific material types, so I'm going to roll them into one again. Are all of the kind of workflows and approaches and things we've talked about here universally applicable? So let's say, for argument's sake, I make denim products. Are there gaps or kind of chasms in maturity in terms of how well suited fabric digitization is to denim, or how well, for example, like sheer materials or laces or whatever are represented in 3D? I guess, is this a tide that raises all boats situation, or is there still some variability in how kind of different material types and different product types are elevated? And Kate, I'll let you have that one.
I would say, broadly, you can do whatever it is you want to do with 3D. It's just a question of like, how do you get there? You need to set your goals about, how good do you want things to look and how accurate do you want things to look, and then you figure out your sort of your technology path to get there. A huge number of material types can be accommodated with existing solutions. I think there are some exceptions where you might not be able to do the easiest or cheapest solution for certain material types. But I would say denim is a difficult category for sure to represent in 3D, because of all the washing that happens and how every piece is going to be subtly different. So it's possible. It's not very scalable at this moment. But there are, companies like Genealogia, and maybe there's a few others that, they're working with a laser machine, so they can,
Yep.
there's some integration there between, I think they have a plugin to Clo 3D actually, so you can start to bring in some of their designs and get a certain visualization. It just, again, it depends on the quality that you're looking for, and then what product category and material you need.
Yeah, perfect. So I was going to try and roll two questions together here. I don't think I can do it. Let's do them separately. When we think about, so Brendan mentioned extending the value of digital assets. I've had a couple of questions around downstream. So around one is kind of trust in 3D renders as representations on e-commerce. The other is around virtual try-on, around how digital materials can start to interact with that kind of thing. Because virtual try-on, there's various schools of thought. Should it be subjective? Should it be completely objective and accurate? I guess the one point of commonality between it all is if you're doing a AR enhanced VTO situation, you want to know that the material is going to roughly look and behave on that digital representation the way that it would in person. Where are we at on that journey? Brendan, I've picked you just because you were nodding then.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting space. I don't know how accurate it will be on, an AR, VR type experience. If you're like using your own body in a physical way with a digital asset, I think we're a little bit behind there, and there's still a lot of work to be done. From an online experience perspective, if you're looking at maybe a digital avatar that is compiled of a bunch of different body types and shapes that is leveraging a digital asset on those compiled data points of bodies, I think that is pretty accurate, and it gives you a pretty good representation to give you enough of a decision point to be able to purchase that garment. But when it comes to outfitting or any sort of like VR AR experience, I think we're a little bit behind there, and there's a lot of work to do.
Okay, perfect. Final question. Now, audience folks, I have not managed to address all of these. We will do our very best to tackle them some other way afterwards. There's a lot, and there's a lot of very detailed ones. The final one I want to just pick up on, because I know we're slightly over time, and this is the end, is around usability from a tools point of view. So it's fair to say that the industry as a whole is more mature in the DPC area than it has been in the past. But I think there's still the idea that it is a specialized discipline and that there is a fairly steep learning curve when it comes to starting to take advantage of some of these things and create digital materials and work with digital materials. What are you each seeing as the trend in that area? So again, but both of you for this one, short answer if possible. Like, are we trending in the right direction on usability and kind of bringing people into this journey? And Kate, I'll start with you.
I think we are. I think on the digital materials front, when we start hopefully getting into, solutions that are more scalable, that will also necessarily mean that they're kind of less complicated, they're less difficult to use, they're going to require less of that specialized knowledge. When it comes to, 3D asset creation, I think that like the current 3D garment simulation tools are already significantly easier to use than some of the broader DCC tools, and I think that is also kind of trending positively. I think but of course, depending on your goals and what kind of assets you need to make, it still does it takes skill. There's kind of no getting around that. What do you, Brendan?
Yeah, I think we are trending in the right direction. The number one most important critical thing, I think, being creating a internal educational learning and development approach where you can, not just like teach people how to use it, but have them understand why we're doing this and what the implications and benefits are. So things like this webinar, the Interline, Works online, website. I think there's so many great, examples out there and educational awareness type places where you can learn more, and having that be an internal support system for your teammates and your associates is super important, so that they can start thinking themselves, how can I use this differently? How can I use this to improve my workflow? And I think that's now starting, just because of the fact that it's being taught so widely in universities and schools. People are coming out of school with this knowledge, expecting to work in this type of way. So building that internal capability of learning, development, and education is really important. I think we're starting to get there.
Amazing. We are over time. So again, apologies that we weren't able to get to everybody's audience questions. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Like an amazing turnout, and I think that's a testament to the great speakers that I've had with me today. I really appreciated having you both on board. Somebody did ask, what can we see what renders look like on a digital avatar? It's new to them, like a reference image of what these things look like. There are examples of those. Again, we have our DPC report coming out. We commissioned 3 designers. There are various digital materials workflows. Keep an eye out for that through the Interline. Kate, I'll give you the floor to you for just a closing message. And if you want to point anybody towards any resources on Cottonworks that really showcase what this kind of thing can look like, then now's your opportunity. But from me, thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us live. Thanks to everybody who joined us on demand. And thank you to Kate and Brandon for putting up with all my questions.
Thank you so much, Ben. Yeah, absolutely. Please check back with us. Next week, we'll have this recording up, and you can visit Cottonworks under topics to find this recording and all of our other DPC-related educational materials. We do have some materials also online where you can see a little bit about how these looks. But I think there's a ton of content in those videos if you want to learn more and start to get a handle on that. So thank you all so much for joining us. Please check back with us next week and next year, as we're going to have more education available. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kate. Thanks, everyone.
So much.